I now welcome Rebecca Adams to the stage to introduce us to the Child Poverty Action Group.
Kia ora koutou, ko Rebecca Adams Tukuitonga. It's a real privilege to be here today to welcome you to the post-budget breakfast, and I just wanted to say a few words about Child Poverty Action Group. It's we provide policy advice and research and promote child poverty action in the community, and just really privileged to have Alan Johnson speak on behalf of the group today, and Nikki Turner and Tony Dell as our fellow leadership group in Wellington. So welcome, and look forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Dr. Rao Adhikari, representing the Wellington branch of the Public Health Association New Zealand.
Kia ora, thank you, Gail. Kia ora, tina kotu katoa. Pai, kite kite, ia koe katoa. I'm Shamubeel Eaqub, representing the Public Health Association of New Zealand Wellington branch. The Public Health Association welcomes everyone to this year's post-budget breakfast event again. Since 1988, Public Health Association has been leading advocate in the public health sector, fostering innovation and collaboration. Our diverse community, including professionals, researchers, policymakers, and advocates, shares a vision of creating a healthier, more equitable, and sustainable New Zealand. We currently boast approximately 500 members. PHANZ has been at the forefront of shaping public health policy and practice in our culturally rich country. Our association plays a critical role in advocating for health equity, disease prevention, health promotion, and overall well-being of our whānau and communities. As we often say, he waka ikinua, we are all in this together. Our branches across different regions of Aotearoa and our dedicated caucuses works tirelessly to ensure that our diverse communities are represented and heard. We strive to address the unique health challenges faced by different groups and promote policies that foster health equity. Health equity in Aotearoa is not just a goal. It is a commitment. We believe that everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, deserves the opportunity to live a healthy life. As an old Maori proverb, "Waio ite toipoto, kua ite toira," let's keep us close together, not far apart. The wisdom guide us in our efforts to close the gaps in health disparities and bring about lasting change. Join us and be part of this vibrant community. Together we can amplify our voices and advocate for a fairer, healthier New Zealand, as we often remind ourselves, ihara takutua, itetua, takitahi, ingari he tua, takitini. My strength is not as an individual, but as a collective. Let's embrace the journey with enthusiasm and determination, knowing each step we take brings us closer to a future where health equity is reality for all. Anyone from the community or any sector can become a member of our association. Join us in being voice of our communities and whānau for equitable health outcomes in Aotearoa. Thank you for your dedication and commitment to this cause. Nami, kia pai tera. Have a good day.
And next is Dr. Jude Wall, who will speak about the Public Health Communication Centre.
Kia ora koutou. The Public Health Communication Centre is an organisation dedicated to increasing the reach and impact of public health research, making it more accessible to the public, to decision makers and policy makers. Professor Michael Baker is the director of the centre. Unfortunately, he can't be here today. He's out of Wellington, but he will be joining us by live stream. So he asked me to share these few words of welcome on his behalf. The Public Health Communication Centre is delighted to support the post-budget breakfast, a long-standing event in the Wellington calendar and an important one. This opportunity to come together to discuss the implications of the budget and hear expert commentary from a social justice and public health perspective is vital. I wish you all a warm welcome and a particular welcome to and thanks to the esteemed speakers who we are about to hear from. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Gail Duncan, Chair of the Social Justice Group here at St Peter's on Willis. I am thrilled to welcome you, both those with us online soon and those of you who are here in one of the homes of social justice in Wellington. Since 1848, this building has sheltered earthquake victims, given sanctuary in 1913 to waterside workers being chased down Willis Street by Massey's Cossacks during the Watersiders' strike, started the nuclear-free Wellington movement and continues to help settle refugees. It has helped refugees from the very early days, supported those in the community who needed care and sustenance, founded charitable organisations, and now is welcoming all of you as advocates for the rights and support of all our people, particularly children, our future. St Peter's Social Justice Group and our colleagues here today provide a voice for children and all persons in many forums at local and national level, including presenting to select committees. We have been presenting to select committees week by week over the last 5 weeks, including the Aotearoa Healthy Futures Bill, inclusion of mental health and addictions, and as part of the Aotearoa overarching health process. The strength of our combined voices are acknowledged by the presence of some dignitaries here today. To be a fair and just society with prosperity for all, we must advocate strongly for our children to have equality of opportunity, our families to have freedom from hunger, and children to have safe care and a home to grow up in. We demand that the basic needs for children to flourish and grow into mature and productive citizens are met for all children growing up in this country. At St Peter's, we encourage and support an open, multicultural, multi-faith community based around our Willis Street campus, supporting ECTA, the Ethnic Food Bank, and the Free Store, which provides free food and contributed by cafes and food suppliers in the Wellington area. The Free Store collectors push their trolleys in the footsteps of Mother Albert, founder of the Home of Compassion, the first providers of support to disadvantaged children and families in this city. So welcome to you all. Listen to the messages of our presenters on this budget and go and advocate for our future for all of us. Please let me pass you to introduce our commentator, our MC, Edward Cowley. So we're a little bit ahead of time for live streaming, unless you're in. Yeah, we're in. So, Edward, you're welcome to.
There you go. Great. Morena koutou. Before we start, since we are in this incredible building, it's only fitting that the custodians of this building welcome us and with a karakia. So please, karakia for us. Kia ora.
I'd just like to, on behalf of the clergy at St Peter's on Willis, to welcome you here this morning well done you. I think if you look around, the numbers of people here is an expression of the concern and growing concern of so many of us as to the situation that New Zealand finds itself in, both economically and socially. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Please stay and visit, as well as information. This is an excellent opportunity to build coalition and network. So welcome to St Peters.
Kia ora koutou. I know quite a few of you have come in since Gail did her safety briefing. So just if there is an issue, it's hard to drop cover and hold when you're in a pew, but do your best and someone will be at the microphone to give you instructions. If you need the wharepaku toilet, it's downstairs, so we won't be judging you if you have to walk that way, through that door with the running man on it, and down the stairs and across the big room at the bottom to find the toilets. My name's Jean Malcolm. I'm one of the priests here, and I'm going to lead us in karakia. You may, if you recognise a divine, and you are welcome to enter into this prayer. If that's not your practice, then please just be still and allow the presence of one another to hold you. E te atua, te kaihanga o te ao, te kai aroha o ngā mea katoa. E arohaina mātou e koe, e hia ana koe ki a mātou, kia tia ki tētahi ki tētahi. Kua tā mai mātou i tēnei ata ki te whakarongo, me te urupare ki te wero, ki te tiaki ki tō tātou hāpori. Manakitia tō tātou huihuinga i tēnei ata. Homai ki a mātou te maia ki te whakarongo pai, me te tuku ai mātou ki te kawe i te tika me te aroha ki ngā mea katoa kei a tātou. Holy God, creator of the world, lover of all things, you love us and long for us to care for one another. We come today to listen and to respond to the challenge to care for our community. Bless our gathering this morning.
Give us courage to listen deeply and commit ourselves to bringing justice and aroha to all that we are part of.
Amen.
Kia ora. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. O te whātalo whātu i lepe ia le mamaro le nei au whia. I maro lamla soi fua ma le rangi mai maua, no mai, hare mai, piki mai, kaki mai, and an extremely warm welcome to you all who have gathered here this morning in this beautiful building. My name is Edward Cowley and I'm your wrangler this morning. It is my job to introduce and segue into all of our esteemed speakers. It is your job to sit back, relax and listen to what the speakers are saying. It's very straightforward. Gail did mention that over the last little while I've been very busy at the select committees. Today's format, this morning's format, is going to be taking that of a select committee. So our speakers will speak for 10 minutes and then there will be a question. When I say a question, it is a question. It is not a comment. It is not a thought. So if you could please phrase your comment, thought or feeling, being into a question, that would be fantastic. Our time is limited. It is also my role to ensure that we respectfully maintain time, because no one wants to be late to work this morning, do we? No, we don't. So it's great that you all managed to get out of bed nice and early. I myself am an early riser, so when Gail said, can you be here at 6:30? I thought to myself, I can be there at 4:30 if you want. However, 6:30 was fine. So I'm pleased you all managed to be here. It was a beautiful morning. It wasn't raining. I was able to do a 10-minute brisk walk. So I think that's about it really. You know, a lot went on yesterday, and someone said to me, did you actually listen to the budget? I was on a plane. I didn't actually listen to it. I read some of the stuff this morning. So for me, this will be an enlightening perspective and a Edward Cowley cheat sheet about what went on, so that I don't have to go and then Google it myself when I get out of here. So I would like to bring up all our speakers. Here we go. So you've all got a program, have you not? I'm not going to read everything that you see in there because you can all read it yourself, I'm sure. However, I do have some personal information about our speakers, which I will gladly share with you. So don't expect me to be reading that, because otherwise we'll just be covering things you already know. So could I invite to the stage, please, Sir Collin Tukuitonga. Thank you. Yeah, we're going to bring you up to have a seat. Saunoamaali'i, Karanina, Sumeo. Alan Johnson. So Craig Renney is here, but he is not here. So he's currently doing a radio interview with Radio New Zealand, but when it's his time to speak, one of those empty chairs is where he will be sitting. Shamubeel Eaqub will be zooming in, so I'm not sure if he's up there, but you can see his name on there. So when it is his turn to speak, he will be zooming in. Max Rashbrooke. Are you all okay with those? One seems to know what they're doing with the microphones. You're popping them on now. For all our lovely people zooming in, thank you. Nice to have you here. I'd just like to make a few honourable mentions of some people who are in the room. Greg O'Connor, Damien O'Connor, Camilla Ballage, the Honourable David Parker, Gareth Hughes, former Green MP, Miriam Ross, General Manager for the Green Party, Philip Howden, the Chaplain, and Roger Blakely, Greater Wellington City Council. A very warm welcome to you here this morning. Excellent, so we're all set to go. Don't they look beautiful? Please, give them a huge round of applause. Look at that. Maybe I should change my glasses prescription, perhaps. Perhaps not. So I would like to introduce first up Sir Collin Tukuitonga. So Collin is Niuean born. He's a New Zealand doctor, a public health academic, public policy expert, and an advocate for reducing health inequalities among Māori and Pasifika people. Collin's first job when he left school, he was a butcher's assistant. So he knows all about great cuts of meat, which is fantastic. His favourite food is fish oka. So for those of you that don't know what that is, it's a raw fish that's often marinated in lemon, coconut juice. So when you looked at someone who first left school and was a butcher's assistant and now is an extremely high-profile public health professional, from small things come great things. We all start somewhere, and you will know where all of these people on stage, you'll know exactly what their first roles were when they first left school, and now we are sitting among giants. So please, pati pati mai and welcome Sir Collin Whanotau Tukuitonga.
Oh, thank you, Edward. Morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Gail, for the invitation. I told my wife this morning that I was speaking to you in a church, and she said, you should try it more often, it's good for you. I'm just going to focus on the health components of the budget, and it's possible that I might have missed some information. I haven't sat down and religiously studied it all, so if I made an error, please correct me. The day before yesterday, the good people at the Stats New Zealand released the census from 2023. Some very interesting information about ourselves. The two points that stood out for me, one was we're getting older. I guess that's not a surprise, but New Zealand population getting older, and we're getting more diverse. And Māori folk who claim Māori heritage is closing in on 1 million people for the first time. Significant trends for our country. And I say this, I refer to this because aging populations and diversity are two of the most important drivers of healthcare costs. The other thing to say, of course, is that we need to reflect on our approach to public policy. This idea that we could squeeze everyone into this particular mold is flawed, fundamentally flawed. Universalism is fine if you are well-connected, well-informed, middle class. But it's hopeless in a population that is diverse. You can disagree with me afterwards, of course. I do want to commend Dr. Shane Renney. Getting $16.68 billion is not a small challenge, particularly when our planes are not flying reliably and our ships in the Navy can't sail, and all of those things that we have to support. So I commend him. I also support his idea of health targets. But I do want to say this, that if we rely on conventional thinking, conventional delivery, we're not going to get anywhere with the targets. Saying he wants to achieve 95% uptake of immunization is pie in the sky. Forgive me, Dr. Renney. If you're just going to rely on what we've always done, I'll talk a little more about this later. So we, in the announcement yesterday, 3.44 billion for hospital specialist services, 2.12 billion for primary care, including public health, etc. Personally, I would have flipped it around and given 3.44 to primary care and public health, to be honest. No question that our health system, the hospitals, everyone is stressed, no question. But you've got to try to get ahead of yourself, and putting more money into hospital beds, yes, it's necessary, but it doesn't actually get us anywhere. That's the reason why I suggested. The other thing is workforce is our biggest challenge, and yet I see 22 million to train 25 additional doctors. I seem to recall that in the pre-election hype, they were talking about a Waikato third medical school and 50 new doctors. So clearly there's not enough focus on the workforce in my view. The other problem with health is I describe it as a marshmallow. By that I mean if you prod it on one side, it pops out the other side, sometimes where you least expect it. So take the 71 million supposedly saved by reintroducing prescription charges. I think it's flawed, because access to medication at the early stage of the healthcare journey hopefully delays or postpones serious consequences that might need hospital care. That's what I mean by a marshmallow. There's a fixed thing that we all have to deal with, and if you don't deal with it intelligently, you end up with things that you didn't expect. So another one is the school lunches. Plenty of evidence of benefits to the young person in a biological sense, getting fed, but there's plenty of evidence of benefits beyond that. And Seymour is gloating to his sponsors about the $100 million that he saved. My friends who are nutritionists tell me that actually the product on offer is inferior, and there are consequences beyond making food available. So that's what I mean by we've got to be careful, because doing something that is not supported by the evidence could end up costing us more. Just some other observations. No sign of cancer drugs. There is, of course, a 1.71 billion allocation of PHANZ, and I think it's good. But as I say, it's possible that it's in there and I haven't picked it up. But this was something that they made a big song and dance about pre-election, access to cancer drugs, because actually we're not doing that well comparatively in terms of access to effective cancer drugs. The other problem I have with all of this is trust or lack thereof. There's some stuff about people involved in decision making around PHANZ, which makes you wonder about the transparency, the ethics of people who invest in pharmaceutical. The pharmaceutical industry is a challenge at the best of time. And I think where you have questions about the people involved in decision making for access to medication in our country, that's a concern for me. Trust is a problem. I'll go back to workforce. We cannot continue, sorry Edward, I'm almost done. We cannot continue to just meander along with our medical workforce. You have to make some bold decisions. And you recall what I said about diversity in our country, and it follows that we need to support a diverse health workforce. A diverse health workforce is not political correctness. A diverse health workforce improves health outcomes. The evidence around the world is clear. And these incremental allocations to a little bit here and a little bit there isn't going to solve the challenges we have with our workforce. And we all know, of course, skip across the Tasman and you're in a different situation. We have to do better on the health workforce in our country, no question. And I would have personally liked to have seen a bold, more imaginative approach to improving the workforce and the retention of the talents that we have, because we're losing that little number to countries in the OECD group. And my last point is, being a champion of support for Pacific providers forever. Nothing in the statement, which I think is unfortunate. Let me give you an example. When we rolled out the COVID-19 vaccination program, we struggled with Pacific communities not responding. The Tongans showed us how to do it. They organized drive-ins through the churches. And lo and behold, the Pacific uptake went to the high 90s. In fact, the Pacific uptake of dose 1 and 2 was the best in the country. That tells me that relying on convention and doing what we've always done will get us what we always got. That's why you need to engage, involve communities that are most affected. So that's pretty much my final my comment. And my final thought is, perhaps we are expecting a healthcare level that we cannot afford. That maybe it's a different conversation. That our champagne tastes and expectations is no longer affordable on a beer budget. Hope I'm wrong, but the approach that is being provided isn't going to deliver us what we need for an increasingly diverse community. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Respectfully, it would be great if we could have more time for questions at this stage. We were sort of just doing one question per speaker, given we would like to sort of be on time. Well, my role is to ensure that we're on time. So next up, we have a human rights perspective, from a disabled perspective, Saunoamaali'i, Karanina Sumeo. And she's from the Equal Opportunities Employment Commissioner, and she's Acting Race Relations Commissioner, and the Acting Chief Commissioner at the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. She's of Samoan descent and originally from the villages of Vailima in Upolu, Samoa. So I asked all of our speakers what their aspirations was and what was their dream job, what they'd like to do when they were a child. When I asked Saunoamaali'i this question, she said, actually, I never used to think that far ahead, and I was a free spirit, which is quite fantastic, really. Her very first role, she's been a public servant for all of her life, really. So I asked her what her first role of paid work was. She worked for the Public Service Investment Society, the PHCC, and her favourite food in life, just like Sir Collin, is oka, the raw fish delicacy from the South Pacific. Twins, even. Please, pachi mai, and welcome Saunoamaali'i, Karanina, Sumeo.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā iwi, tēnā koutou. Te Aotearoa, Ngāti Toa, tēnā koutou. Thank you, Gail, for inviting me back to the whare. It's a real privilege to be here, and I think when we know what's happening around the world with wars and trauma and genocide, it feels good to be safe. And I always feel safe when I come here. And I feel safe to be living in this country. And we have all contributed to that, to creating that environment. But we know it's not paradise for everybody. We're not yet equal. And it's not yet a fair society for everybody. So I welcome the opportunity to be here today to speak from a human rights perspective. And I want to speak particularly from the perspective of our disabled peoples. Some of you may know that in 2008, our government ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It reaffirms the rights of people with disabilities. And accompanied by that, we have a Bill of Rights Act, 1990, that also guarantees basic freedom, civil and political rights. The problem with our Bill of Rights is it doesn't guarantee the right to health or the right to education, such as inclusive education, which is so important for our disabled children, or a right to social security. So in reflecting on the context we're in now, in terms of high cost of living, high inflation, etc., the tax cuts proposed in the budget don't quite make it, won't quite help us live that dignified life that we envisage for everybody. We have a Disability Action Plan, 2019-2023. It ended last year. We're still waiting for a new version of that. And in 2022, New Zealand was examined at the UN in terms of our efforts to progress the rights of disabled peoples. 60 recommendations came out of that examination. We accepted only 51, and of those, 17 we accepted with no modifications, but 38 we accepted with modifications. For example, houses being built by the government, for example, we want them to all be accessible. But that's only, correct me if I'm wrong, France is about 5 or 10%. It's not all accessible. There you go. So that's what you call with modifications. So ideally, our next disability action plan should take into account the recommendations from that examination at the United Nations and make sure that we uphold the rights of our disabled peoples. I was happy to that we were greeted by our sister here from the Child Poverty Action Group. Based on our last measures, and we have economists who can correct us, but about 22.3% of disabled children were living in hardship. 21.5% of Māori children lived in hardship. 28.9% of Pacific children were living in hardship. And then overall, 12.5% of our children are living in hardship. There is no excuse for that in a rich and wealthy nation as Aotearoa. Absolutely no excuse for it. One of the significant things about disabled communities is that 66% live on an income under $30,000. Who can survive on an income under $30,000 in a rich nation as us? And so I was interested to look in the budget, thinking about disabled communities, and looking at that income of $30,000, a significant number would be on the benefit. And so one of the concerns that we have is around the sanctions that have been imposed on people who are on the employment benefit. I know as the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission that despite qualifications, despite willingness, despite efforts to get into employment, it's not that easy. And when you're in employment, you can still be poor. We have an N-word poor. So one of the significant things that happened in the last budget was the removal of the minimum wage exemption for people with disabilities, because some were earning $2 an hour working full-time. Again, we are not equal. So there was an attempt in the last budget to, well, it wasn't an attempt, it was a decision that was made to get rid of that exemption and to be replaced by wage subsidies. And it was estimated at that time there would be about 800 disabled workers who would have benefited from that. I couldn't find evidence in the budget this year of honoring that commitment to our disabled workers. So where is our commitment to equality and inclusion and fairness for our disabled workers? Be they young workers, older workers, where is that commitment? And hence my concern about our Bill of Rights not including the right to social security or indeed the right to decent work. Because if we were passing all these budgets things, we should be looking at our BORA as a check. Are we doing this right? So we have gaps in our Bill of Rights, even though we have signed these international conventions to honor the rights of all of our Indigenous peoples, be they children or our older workers, as our brother there has raised. So that is one concern for me. On the positive, it was good to see 1.1 billion going to Whaikaha, but of course Whaikaha is not there to solve everything for the rest of the public service in terms of their duty to our people. So that's a good sign, but it's not enough. It was good to see in terms of inclusive education, some additional support for learning support staff. But again, we want every staff that has anything to do with our children in education, from ECE upwards, to have the appropriate upskilling and the knowledge and the confidence and time to do the best for our children as they learn. This is our future. In terms of violence and abuse, the last figures we had from Te Aotearoa, around 52% of disabled people are likely to experience sexual assault in their lifetime. Again, these are all avoidable harms. And why is it that still in this paradise of ours, it appears tolerable to treat our disabled children, women especially, and men in that way? We still have a long way to go in terms of basically respecting each other as human beings. So we've got a long way to go. In terms of looking ahead at the future, in terms of benefits for our disabled people as well, in the budget, there's mention of money going to 1,500 social housing places. Have we looked at the data to see how many disabled peoples or families would benefit from that? We don't yet know, so I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Apart from looking on the surface, it's a good thing generally. But we don't know if there's any targeted proportion to ensure that our disabled peoples access those social housing supports. It's good to see our family boost for ECE, but again, we need to look at how many disabled children will benefit from that. The prescription charges, that's going to impact our disabled peoples and disabled families. So yes, they've said we'll continue for under 14, for 65 and over, those of a community services card, but what about the rest? And every dollar counts when you're living on $30,000 a year. That is a significant issue. Again, our Bill of Rights does not guarantee the right to health. And if we did, it would help us look at these decisions in future and look at it through the eyes of our most vulnerable in our community. So going forward, from a human rights perspective, we need to review our Bill of Rights. Review it with the awareness that already it's excluding our duty to our disabled peoples. I would like to see the government revisit its decision around the minimum wage exemption going forward. And I would like the government to look at housing provision that's being proposed going forward to make sure that there are adequate provisions, and we have to write it in, unfortunately, at least a minimum target to make sure that some, at least, of those new houses being built are accessible for our disabled peoples. And we want to see targets for significantly reducing child poverty. That was one of the interesting, how can I say this? It's kind of like we've suddenly assumed that if we sort out other things, that the children will be okay. When we already know from the past that that's not the case. And children can't get themselves out of poverty. So we would like to see targets, with specific targets, focusing on lifting the number of disabled children out of poverty. I'll leave it there for now. Whaftai lava.
Karanina, thank you very much. My question to you is, there was a protest on Wednesday, disabled people gathered on the Parliament. There was a lot of despair there. My question is, how do we bring hope for disabled people? How do we bring that hope that there is opportunity in our community for participation in all of the areas that you have outlined? How do we do that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's the open letter that's out. That's an open letter that's gone to Minister Willis and Minister Upston from quite a range of communities, so DPOs, but also a range of other civil society groups calling on government. One of the things that's quite central is the involvement of our disabled peoples in the design of policies, in the review of policy, and also investment decisions. We are tired of being seen as unable to do that for ourselves. And that's one of the strongest things that's come across, certainly through the Human Rights Commission. It's disabled people wanting to be involved in the design of decisions and investments that will affect their choices and their ability to make decisions about their own lives. A life of dignity, ideally, is a life that you design, not someone else's designs for you. So that's the key, I think, is to have the humility for government, to have humility to come and talk to our DPOs and our civil societies about the best way going forward. It's not asking for much, actually. It's called democracy and participation, which we all have a human right to.
Next up, we have Alan Johnson, who's the convener of the CPAG's Management Committee. So if you had a look at your program, you'll see he has an impressive list of credentials and the work that he has done previously. But I bet you didn't know that when he was a child, he dreamed of being a builder. His very first job out of school, a paid employment, he worked in a diesel mechanics workshop. And his favourite meal is fettuccine. Please, welcome Alan Johnson.
E mihi atu ki a mātou aitua, a mātou i tarangi, a mātou whai e papatuanuku, i mihi ki a korua, i mihi hoki. Ki te whare tūnei ki te tangata whenua o tēnei rohi. Mi mauhara mātou, a mātou tēpuna i tangi hia, i mihi a haere ki te pō, i mihi hoki. Ki a koutou katoa ki te wairui wainanui a mātou mo tēnei rā, I whakanui ki te rā. Let's give thanks for the day. Thank you, Edward, for that introduction. As he said, I aspired to be a builder when I was a child, and I'm still aspiring to be a builder. I'm still trying to be a builder, and I'm a very bad builder. And luckily I found other ways of earning a living during my working life. I'd like to thank particularly the people who've organised this event on behalf of Child Poverty, to thank Gail and Rebecca and Nikki in particular for the efforts they went to just to ensure that this tradition of us gathering here in Wellington to talk about the budget and the broader policy settings around it is an important tradition to continue, and it was one that faltered during the COVID years, and I'm glad to see that we've taken strength to gather together in person and online to ensure that those traditions continue. For me, the budget, like all budgets, is somewhat symbolic. In many respects, they talk about a set of policy settings which don't have relevance to much in our everyday lives, but underneath them, there are some smaller things that actually do. And it's not until you work out what the budget means to those smaller things that you appreciate what it means to you and your communities. And I think sometimes we get immersed in the bigger picture of the budget and lose that smaller picture. I'm not certain where this budget will take us. I think that will emerge over the next year or 18 months. And I'm fearful about that. In terms of those bigger policy settings, it struck me that this budget wasn't an austerity budget. It wasn't a budget such as the mother of all budgets that Ruth Richardson delivered in 1991. It's not looking at reducing the size of the state significantly. It's not addressing questions of indebtedness or of deficits in any great hurry. It is certainly a budget that said that we are happy with much of the settings that we inherited from the previous government, but we're not happy with the allocations within those budgets, and we will do something about it. In many respects, some of the changes are, in the bigger sense, small change, but they are designed to placate the supporters of the government and to annoy the detractors of the government, and I think they've certainly done that. In terms of housing, and that's an area that I have a particular interest in, and I wasn't able to look at the housing budgets in some detail during our analysis yesterday up in Auckland, for the reason that I was trying to look at the bigger picture at the same time as run a collaborative exercise, which was a new learning for us, I have to say. But it appears to me that the hallmark of the government's housing policy is to take the money that they've otherwise saved from the first home grants and allocate it into social housing in the so-called community housing sector. They anticipate that over the 3 years from 2025 onwards, that they will be able to build 1,500 additional social houses with a budget which is somewhere between $140 and $240 million. I'm sceptical that you can do that. If you work out what $140 million divided by 1,500 houses is, it works out to about $90,000 a year. I'm involved in two small community housing providers, and $90,000 a year won't. $90,000 a house won't cut it in terms of putting a viable project together. And last night I stayed with a friend who had the great patience to wait at the airport until 11 o'clock and my late plane arrived. And he's involved in a significant housing trust, and he invited me to the opening of a 37-unit complex in South Auckland next month. And the new Minister of Housing will be there. And one of the reasons for that, we expect, is that this is a social housing project that has been built with no capital from the government. Where does the capital come from? It comes from private money. This is a privately owned and financed social housing project. And for me, that's a contradiction in terms. But we may see that what the future holds for social housing is that it's private capital that builds social housing, and in my view, that's not social housing. It's housing that's provided for profit, for a long-term gain, which there's nothing wrong with that, of course, but it's not the sort of way we house the poorest, most vulnerable people in New Zealand. History has shown us that. The budget, I think, and the lack of money towards, and that lack of any interest towards Kainga will ensure that when it runs to the end of its funding envelope, which is the middle of next year, it will be gutted. There was much that needed improvement in Kainga, but the reality is it was starting to build up a momentum to allow it to build significant, to build social housing, public housing at scale, and that will be lost. And I think the token of 1,500 houses in the subsequent 3 years will start to show about this time next year, when we start to see homelessness on the streets and in the car parks and in the cars and in the garages of this country start to increase again. We won't see that immediately, but we'll see it gradually. And I'll come back to that as a question right at the end. But for me, there is a significant concern that we will see children living in cars again. We will see more people living on the streets than already do. We will see people crowding into houses and sharing the illnesses that they bring with them. And we will see this happening to a particular group of people whom we all know and whom we all possibly think about. One of the things that, when we looked at the budget yesterday, we found no discernible interest in addressing child poverty. And I think Max is going to talk about those figures in some detail later. But there was no real effort, no real concern about child poverty. And in fact, it's somewhat magical to think that the government believes that the way out of child poverty is for a child's mother, particularly, to get a job, and that way, of course, they'll lift the family out of poverty. But this is in a job market which is acknowledged as being slightly contracting, and with wages and incomes that aren't growing significantly. So it's idle to think that we will resolve child poverty through labour market sort of conditions. And there's no other evidence that the government is focusing at all on what it can do about that. If you look, for example, at the Working for Families budgets, in real terms they are static, they are not changing. So there's no additional injection into family income through Working for Families. So nothing changes. And the thing that concerns me, is just a thought I'll leave and possibly we need to reflect on. My big concern is that no one cares. That really we've had child poverty, we've had homelessness, we've had it all, and nothing changes much. So why do we keep on caring? And I think we run the risk as a society of having a sort of fatigue around empathy and compassion. And I think that is the thing that we need most to guard against, for the reason that if we don't, then we'll continue to have budgets like the one we've just had that remain indifferent to the plight of the poorest and the most vulnerable, and accepts as a given that their conditions and the things they experience and the things they suffer are an inevitable consequence of the political economy we run. And what's most disappointing, although not surprising, is this lack of any interest in any substantive change to the way the society's run.
So I'll leave you with that grim view, but my view is that activism and mobilisation and connection can actually be the things that fight against that fatigue of compassion and empathy. But I'll leave you with that, and sorry if I haven't covered much in the budget. Yep.
We do have time for one question. Should there be any from the floor?
Remarkably, no. Oh, yes.
There we go. Thank you.
I think you were an advocate against the selling off of houses when Bill English was housing minister. Do you have a comment on his role in the demolition job on Kaingaora?
Look, I think Child Poverty Action Group is involved in action stations in the campaign to save public housing, and we're very specific that this is public housing owned by the state. And we preempted the Bill English report by suggesting that there was going to be a narrative around the indebtedness of Kaingaora, which was going to be used as a way of basically undermining Kaingaora. And to a degree, that narrative has played out. The Bill English report suggested that Kaingaora wasn't sustainable. And we said, what does that mean? New Zealand's superannuation isn't sustainable unless the government puts $1 billion, $1.5 billion in each year and manages to do that quietly in every budget. The sustainability of any public service is dependent on the will of the government and the people to support it. So the question of Kaingaora's sustainability, I think, is a distraction. And in particular, the report identified that Kaingaora's projection for its debt was going to go from $12 billion presently to about $23 billion by 2028. Of course it will. The government wasn't giving it money to build houses, and it had a program of building which must have been funded from debt. So we've presented this idea that debt's a bad thing. It's only a bad thing, apparently, if you build houses for poor people. It's not a bad thing if you use it for other terms. But what's disappointing, and I didn't say that for the applause, by the way, but what's disappointing is what's come out subsequently is the lack of any real engagement with the Board of Kaingaora in the preparation of that report. And I think it does speak volumes about the extent to which there was a massive predetermination in what the report would find. My view is that the government won't implement most of the recommendations of the report. It's cherry-picked the bits it wanted from it to do a hatchet job on Kaingaora. I think this time next year it will start to appreciate how little it has done in housing, and how, as in the previous national government, the panic button will be pushed and there will be an attempt to do something about housing, but it takes a long time to respond to the needs of the person living in the park bench or living in the car. And I think the government will go into the next election lamenting its lack of interest in housing.
Many thanks, Alan. Welcome, Craig. So Craig was disappeared not so long ago. Craig has now materialised after his Radio New Zealand interview. Craig Renney is an economist and a director of policy for the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. He's going to be offering up his union perspective this morning. You can read the rest of what Craig gets up to in your program, but you will not know, this is hilarious, when Craig was a child, he dreamed of writing a budget. And his first experience was in and around the age 9, but by the age of 12 he knew exactly what he wanted to do. So it was no surprise when I asked him about his first job, and he was, due to his love of numbers, calling bingo was his first job. So a good foray into the work that was yet to become him and to find him. But his favourite food is green jelly. Welcome, Craig Renney.
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou, ko Karanina ho. I'm Karanina, economist and director of policy at the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, or Te Kawe Kamahi. Can I thank CPAG for organising this event, and I'm honoured to be in such auspicious company here with you today. There is a lot in common with being an economist and being a bingo caller. There's a lot of money involved. People have their hopes up. You get to shout random numbers into a room. And everyone's just on a timeline until someone in the audience shouts at you. And so there's a lot involved. And it was a really good training. So I'm really pleased to be here. A US president famously said, "Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value." This budget demonstrates the values of this government. It's a budget that places its ideological wants before Aotearoa's real needs. The government wants to cut taxes. The government wants to cut spending. The government wants to build more roads. Lord knows we want to build more roads. But it can't deliver the investment that New Zealanders need. In short, this budget fails the most important test going. Will it actually help deliver a better Aotearoa? The Minister of Finance, Nicola Willis, said her own tests in opposition. She said her tax cut wouldn't require any additional borrowing. On this metric, the government's failing. According to the Treasury, it's going to borrow an additional $17.1 billion. Tax cuts, just personal tax cuts, cost $10 billion. The tax package overall, $14.7. If you didn't have those tax cuts, you wouldn't need that borrowing. Future taxpayers are going to pay for the tax cut we're going to get today. Ms Willis also claimed that she was able to deliver all of National's election promises regardless of the state the previous government left the books in. Yet the tax cut programme doesn't include the Working for Families changes promised during the election campaign. The gambling tax changes are supposed to bring in $716 million, yet they now only bring in $190. It's now clear the tax package as promised during the election campaign isn't being delivered. Now, from a union perspective, these things are all interesting, but the budget fails the test of not cutting frontline staff and frontline workers. I call them working people, not frontline staff. It's cutting 240 lines of expenditure in total. That's $10 billion from public services. The Minister of Finance has made it clear that there'll be further rounds of cuts in future budgets, saying this will be a feature of future budgets. Real terms cuts are penciled in to operating grants for education. Vote Customs sees no investment at all, only cuts. Serious fraud sees only cuts. The same is true for agriculture, biosecurity, fisheries, food safety, as it is for Māori development and for Pacific peoples. Quite how cutting both those areas helps us build a more equitable and inclusive society is logic I feel the government should be compelled to give. It will be easy at this point to focus on just, in this city, in Wellington, on the more than 5,000 public sector roles that are being cut. And these aren't the woke, latte-sipping Marxist claimed by the cartoon villains, the Taxpayers Union. They're workers doing valuable work, supporting their families, delivering the public services we need. Overall, 47,000 more people will be unemployed on these forecasts since this government took office. There's no plan to reduce that number. There's no plan to retrain. There's no plan for a just transition for any of those workers. If your only plan to tackle the cost of living is to make tens of thousands of people unemployed, get a better plan. That plan also decimates the funding that's provided to support our labour market functions, particularly health and safety, something that's real importance to the trade union movement. More than $10 million is cut from WorkSafe over the next 4 years. We're still a country that kills 17 workers a week as a consequence of their work. We injure a worker every 15 minutes so badly it takes them away from their work for a week. Yet employment policy is cut. Employment relations services are cut. Fair pay agreements are gone. And in their replace, 90-day trials return. Workforce development councils designed to deliver the skills and the people of the future in the areas we know we have shortages, they're cut completely. Much was made by the government during the election campaign that funding will be made available for health, enough to meet inflation and our population needs. Yet in March, the Ministry of Health told the Health Select Committee that the funding now being provided in this budget wouldn't be enough, yet they delivered it anyway. We're spending more money on security guards for A&E than we are on training new doctors. Funding was also promised for cancer drugs, and that funding hasn't been made available, and indeed you'll now need to pay for your own prescriptions. Funding was supposed to be made available for a new university medical school at the University of Waikato. That doesn't exist. There's nothing meaningful to replace the Māori Health Authority, because Māori Health is going so well, right? What is now available is cigarettes, all to help pay for the tax bill. The budget, importantly, fails the test of helping to tackle child poverty, and I'm confident that my friend Max Rashbrooke will talk more about this. He was the one asking the hard questions in the budget lockup. The forecasts appear to show that the 2028 targets for child poverty will be missed, and in some cases, significantly. These are targets that until recently had been the subject of bipartisan agreement in government. The government states, and I can't believe this, a key driver of child poverty is living in a benefit-dependent household. In reality, the key driver of child poverty is not having enough money. It's being poor, something that's not helped by real-term cuts to the minimum wage and cuts to welfare payments. If the government genuinely believed in social investment, it wouldn't be failing this test. And I say this advisedly in this building, so forgive me, Reverend. There are more than 130,000 children in this country who live in material poverty. That means they don't have 2 pairs of shoes, they don't have a winter coat, they feel cold, they live in damp housing. In a country as wealthy as New Zealand, that's a sin, and we should do better. This budget fails the test of preparing New Zealand for the future. Investment in business, science, innovation is cut by $1.4 billion. That includes cuts to elements of the Warma Kiwi Homes programme, which improves the energy efficiency of New Zealand. Tackling climate change is no longer a concern, with $180 million cut from the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority. The National Resilience Plan, set up by the previous government to tackle issues around national disasters and infrastructure, is ended. Quite how we end the problem of homelessness, as Alan talked about, by ending state housing and ending state home building, I have no idea. The government has clearly signalled its values with this budget. Short-term benefits for some in the form of tax cuts will come at the cost of long-term borrowing, rising child poverty, and increasing insecurity from challenges such as climate change and unemployment. According to the Treasury, forecast new spending in the future is unlikely to be sufficient to cover new cost pressures on existing services. That means future cuts in future budgets are baked in. This is just the first budget in where working people, their whānau and their communities will go backwards. Now, at this point, it would be easy to blame this on malice, to frame the government as just being indifferent to the needs of New Zealanders, and I think that would actually be the wrong approach. Rather, this budget demonstrates that this government has placed its political survival over the very real needs of this country. Following me is one of the best economic commentators I've ever heard, Shamubeel, so I'm not going to talk at length about the economic indicators, but let me make one point on the economy here. There's no plan. There's no direction. There's no sense of where we're going to. There's no sense of what good looks like. There's only drift. The economy in this budget is seen as a problem to be managed down, not as a means of delivering prosperity and security to working people. And nothing highlights that more to me than this government squeezing $100 million from the costs of delivering school meals, whilst giving landlords $3 billion in tax reductions at this budget. That's despite the Minister of Finance telling all the nation's journalists yesterday on the stage that that tax cut would do nothing to tackle rising rents. Everything in this budget is a choice. As we said earlier, I've had the great pleasure of writing 3 budgets. I've had the pleasure of writing budgets where we delivered the families package, we delivered the winter energy payment, we lifted child poverty, we tackled many of the issues in front of us. Nothing in the budget is natural. The government has chosen the poor outcomes this budget will deliver. The government has chosen the wrong approach for Aotearoa and for working people. Thank you.
Do we have a question from the floor? Here we go.
One of the joys of being a professional economist is that you get to depress an audience from 250 paces. It's called the dismal science for a reason.
Yeah, I don't want to depress you either, but Craig, thank you. It's alarming to think that the future is increased unemployment and we're heading in that direction, and that's been signalled. So what's your response about how to counteract that? What needs to happen in order to not, to be looking at this train wreck ahead of us, which has been signalled? What do we need to do?
Thank you. I mean, one of the first things you do is first do no harm. Don't make it worse. Don't bring in things that make economic insecurity worse. Don't get rid of fair pay agreements. Don't bring back 90-day trials that don't put anybody back into employment. They just create insecurity for workers at the point at which they're employed. Secondly, have a plan. If you know there are going to be more than 40,000 people unemployed, by the way, that 40,000 people, what does that mean? That increases the number of people who are unemployed in this country by nearly 40%. And that's an optimistic estimate. In my view, it'll be more likely to be 50 by the time we actually get the real numbers. So what are we doing for skills? What are we doing for training? There's nothing in this budget to help plan workforces, to help deliver more training, to help make sure those people are being looked after. Thirdly, when people are unemployed, let's look after them properly. And also, just not when people are unemployed, when everyone has needs, which is everyone during their life, let's make sure they're looked after properly in the budget. Make sure we're spending more money on welfare, make sure people can lead lives of decency. And instead, we're taking money away from that in this budget. So there's plenty of things that we can do. The government, however, fails the test of first doing no harm, because its policies are likely to make more people unemployed and likely to make their unemployment more unbearable as a consequence.
Many thanks, Craig. So we can see our next speaker, looking very handsome up there, Shamubeel Eaqub. So he's an experienced economist known for making economics accessible. Shamubeel, can you hear? Shamubeel, can you hear?
On Zoom, right? I'm unmuted now. Good Lord.
Good morning, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Am I really, really loud?
Excellent. Great. So before we start to hear your economic analysis of the most recent budget, I asked all of our presenters 3 questions. I didn't have the opportunity to ask you this, so perhaps you would like to just answer this before you start. 1, what was your childhood dream? What was your dream job when you were a child that you wanted to do? Number 2.
I want to be a firefighter.
What was that, sorry?
I want to be a fireman.
Wanted to be a fireman. How's that going for you?
Not very well.
There we go. Number 2, what was your first paid employment?
First paid employment was picking berries.
There we go. And finally, what is your favourite food, please?
Chicken curry.
Excellent. Good to know. Thank you very much. The floor is yours. Please welcome Shamubeel.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome, and thank you, Craig, for giving me such a depressing run-up. The economy is a bit depressing, so I thought what I'll do is take you through a little bit about what the forecasts are, why we should take everything with a sack of salt that economists say, and I think some of the consequences for public policy going forward. So I'll show you some pictures just because you don't want to be looking at my ugly mug the whole time. I thought it's quite instructive to look at just the forecasts that underpin and the outlook for New Zealand that was penned in the budget. And it's a very busy picture, but just look at the grey shape and the black line, which is the latest forecast. And on the left-hand side is the level of GDP. It just shows that our economy is going to be smaller. So this is the reality of the recession that we're in. But you can also see that those dotted lines are never correct. So all our predictions are pretty much worthless. So don't believe anything that economists tell you about the future. We're expecting the unemployment rate will increase in the next little while. This is the very real impact of an economic downturn, which is going to be worsened by the fiscal austerity that we have seen announced in the latest budget. The reality is that while the increase in unemployment is, of course, extremely unfortunate, for me, the concern is twofold. That not only will we see the increase in unemployment taking place during a downturn, it's going to be worsened by job cuts in the public sector. And third, we're going to see the increasing kind of meanness and the increasing grudging nature of our welfare system over the course of the next few years. We've already seen sanctions increase. We've already seen the welfare sector as being told to tighten up, which means be less generous. And I find that really troubling because we know that people don't lose their jobs through their own fault, but because the economic conditions have changed. So I'm quite concerned that's going to take place over the course of the next year or so. On the right-hand side, you can see the outlook for inflation is for it to moderate, but we're still living through that big increase in living costs, which has not only created, I guess, the pressures that we see in terms of increasing interest rates and things like that, but more importantly, it's increased the poverty amongst our lower-income households, because the reality is that our low-income households experience inflation in a much greater way with far less flexibility because they simply do not have that extra income, that buffer in their weekly budgets. When it comes to the budget that was announced yesterday, I was doing live TV. It's always a bit of a comedy, right? You're sitting there on live TV commenting on what's happening with the budget when you haven't had a few hours to digest all the details that Craig and others have had. But when you look at the numbers, the headlines are quite interesting. They're interesting in the sense that we've got this massive tax cut that's been announced, but when you look at the total amount of taxes we're going to pay across GST, income tax, corporate taxes and excises, the net amount doesn't change a lot. It's all a sleight of hand. And the reality is that while we've got these tax cuts and we're trying to do all of these kinds of things, we've also got the promise that we saw during the election campaign that we're going to be able to do all of these things without increasing borrowing, except, of course, the borrowing will increase. So the reality of running government is very different from being in opposition, and the next 3 years are going to be very instructive. And as Craig said, it's the beginning of the austerity that we're likely to experience. So on the left-hand side is a picture of government spend in cash terms on operating things, and you can see the forecast is that will fall over the course of the next 3 to 4 years. And on the right-hand side, you can see the forecast for capital spend, which are very high at the moment because there's a lot of projects underway, but will be falling away over the next little while. And so much of the budget is not just about the detail, but even at the high level, it's telling us that we are sending a very clear signal that the government is going to be smaller. This is very much an ideology of the 1980s that if the government just got out of the way, then the economy would be unleashed and people would be free to lift themselves up by the bootstraps. Now, we know there are some operating allowances, some planned increases in spending that are coming through over the next few years, but the reality is that the operating allowances will not be enough to keep services where they are today. There is a shortfall of about the same size as the allowance that's set for 2028. And what I'm trying to tell you is that we would have to spend twice as much of the increase as they have currently planned if we're to keep services where they are. I'm particularly worried for sectors like health, education, for the police force, for our law and order sectors, where there is a huge amount of pressure that's coming through, not just from increases in wage costs, but also the significant need to upkeep our buildings and our assets, which have been neglected for a lot of years. All I was trying to make the point on was around the budget allowances. So in every budget, there are allowances for future spending. So then we can decide where we can allocate those resources depending on need and priorities. But the reality is that compared to where we're today, there is a shortfall in the budget allowance, on the operating allowance, that's probably double the size. So we are going to see this increasing amount of austerity over the next little while. So I think we just need to be really conscious and mindful that this is simply the beginning of the austerity. Every budget from now on will continue to deliver additional austerity. And we know that it's not enough to keep up with the growth in the population. It's not enough to keep up with the growth in the cost of delivering the services. I'm particularly worried for education, health, law and order, because in those areas, the pressures for wages is particularly strong, and the cost of delivering services mostly about people. So there is still a lot of austerity that's still to come down the pipe, and I think we need to be really prepared that the government sector is going to be leaning against the economy for the foreseeable future. On the left-hand side is just a picture of that. It's the net cash balance of government, which is essentially, is the government putting more money into the economy or taking more money out? You can see in 2020, there was a lot of stimulus because of COVID, and then there was the change in the following year, and then we had more support in the year after. But really, since then, the government has been pulling money out of the economy, and we're going to see the government being quite contractionary in the middle of the current recession. But also, I'm very skeptical that just because a government says it's going to do something, that it will do it. On the right-hand side is a picture of actual government spend on infrastructure, and you can see those dotted lines. You know, there's always this hope that we're going to ramp things up. We're going to be great. And by and large, it has failed, except for the last couple of years. And the forecast is we are going to be actually slowing down the amount of infrastructure investment over the course of the next few years. That worries me because, as you know, New Zealand has an extraordinary infrastructure deficit, whether it's in the physical space or in the social space. In the physical space, the infrastructure deficit's in the order of $200 billion, and spending less on it and is not going to get us out of it. So there are some real strong signals here that we are going to see significant shifts and significant downturns in the way that we spend. And it's going to come on the back of public service cuts. We know that there's already the downsizing of head offices in Wellington. Those statistics are not quite visible on the numbers on the left-hand side chart yet, but you can see on the green line that had increased quite a lot in recent years, and we are seeing that being reduced. And the question for me is that if there are fewer people and fewer resources available for these people, how are we going to have the public service that's going to be able to find magically better services, more efficient services, and do it with less money? Because that's really the ask, that somehow we're going to have less spending, less people, and we're going to get better outcomes. It is quite magical in its thinking, and I'm really, really concerned that we are seeing the pressures on the public sector spilling out through the way that the government works. And I just wanted to show you one kind of wonky picture, because this is how I think about government. And, you know, there are things that we set in legislation and rules and regulations that's kind of, you know, the kinds of things we really want to do. And then there is the politics of what citizens want. And in a way, I'm a little bit in two minds about the current budget, because the reality is that New Zealanders voted for something like this. They voted for tax cuts and for austerity, and we're going to have to live with it, and it's going to suck. Because the reality is that politics and the budget is showing what activities they choose to pay for and how it's delivered. And we still haven't seen the details of those kinds of things. You look at the cuts in things like budgeting services, cuts like in things like debt solution services, programs that really work, provide really high value for money. Those things are being cut indiscriminately like everything else. There is no filter over the politics of what they want to do. The signal in this budget is not that we are cutting bad spending. The signal is we are cutting spending. And the business of government, of course, is done through the organization of the public service. It's the people who are in our organizations who do the delivery of the government services. And the reality is that if we're going to be cutting their funding, cutting their numbers, and creating a culture that's really unsettled, are we going to have a comprehensive, coordinated, and consistent public service? I don't think we will see that, at least for the next 12 months. I think there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of pain, and this government is really going to struggle in getting all of those things lined up. So budgets are really important, not just in terms of what it means for the finance minister or which programs are delivering to whom, but also in terms of the impact it has on the people who actually deliver the business of government. I'm really, really worried that the hollowing out of a public sector is going to lead to some significant issues, particularly in the delivery of services for our poor and vulnerable people and in our deprived communities. So, budget slides are really hard to do with Zoom and when I'm far away, but this is my last slide, and I just wanted to kind of go, well, budgets are, of course, extremely political. And this budget in particular was very much about trying to deliver what they had promised in the elections. They didn't quite get there, but they got a lot of it across. It was really about tax cuts, less than they expected, spending cuts, they got quite a bit of it, but not good quality because it's indiscriminate. And they're doing more borrowing, which they said they wouldn't do. The reality is that tax revenues are super costly. They cost billions of dollars, but the individual benefits are quite small. For a poor household, the income increase might be in the order of 0.5%. For a rich household, it might be in the order of 2%. That's maybe 3 months' worth of inflation or 6 months' worth of inflation in the current environment. The reality, though, is that the cost cuts that we're seeing are going to be really widespread. And I still don't know the details of all the policies and all the things that will be cut, because it's not just the envelope, but quite often within that will be the quality of the policies that will be affected. The budget fundamentally sets the envelope of spending, but it doesn't necessarily give us all the details of what will be spent on and the quality. But we know that the direction of travel for the next 3 years has been set very clearly in this budget, and it was intentional. The intentional message and plan is that there will be less government. And the intention is that those cuts will be felt inequitably, and the centre will be weakened for delivery because that is part of the plan. The reality is that this budget for the economy is at the margin in the sense that we know the government is pulling back. That wasn't the issue. If we want to create long-term economic growth, if we want to have more equitable economic growth, if we want to have more equitable outcomes, it's not just about what the budget does, but it's the quality of what happens inside. In this budget, we haven't seen much of that detail. In future budgets, I think what we will see is those cuts will force us to increasingly make very difficult choices. From a public health perspective, I think the concern for me is immediately that our poor and vulnerable will feel the worst of the recession and the impost of the austerity. And in future years, I think we will see many of those important policies that are trying to lift up our poorest and most vulnerable being dismantled slowly and eroding their power. So it is quite a hard budget to swallow from a public health perspective, because it's short term, it is focused very much on those ideological political gains, but there is not much in it that actually builds the foundations for a long-term prosperous New Zealand. So I might stop there.
Thank you. We've got one question just behind you, Gail. Oh, here we go.
Kia ora. Do you think that Aotearoa New Zealand has given away any pretence of being an equitable society in such a way that we'll never get it back, please?
Excellent question. I think we have all told ourselves the pretty little lie that we are an equitable and egalitarian country. It is not true. New Zealand has not been that in a very long time. The reforms of the 1980s, for example, just increased this extraordinary amount of inequality, and that hasn't changed over the course of the last 30 years. So I don't think we can pretend that New Zealand's actually made much progress when it comes to inequality or being egalitarian. I think it was very much by design, and some of my learned friends on the stage might disagree, but I think the undercurrent of racism, the undercurrent of division, the undercurrent of punching down on the poor have always been there. But this budget just laid it bare for all of us to see.
Many thanks, Shamubeel, for joining us this morning. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, and to bring us home, we've got Max Rashbrooke up here. Wellington-based writer and public health intellectual with twin interests in economic inequality and democratic renewal. When Max was a child, he dreamed of being a professional footballer. His first paid employment was with the student newspaper, and his favourite food is a French dish commonly known as cassoulet. Please welcome Max Rashbrooke.
Well, good morning everyone. Kia ora koutou. particularly since my ambitions, never realised, of being a professional footballer have been mentioned. I should explain that if anyone's noticed the bruising around my right eye, it's not because I've been having a fight with Chris Bishop about spending allowances, but it's the result of a footballing accident on Wednesday night. Fortunately, it's not as bad as it looks, unlike yesterday's budget, which was considerably worse than it looked, I think, because it's very much one that, as other speakers have alluded to, focused on satisfying short-term political desires, specifically for a constituency of middle-income families with children and ideally also some investment properties, at the expense of actually dealing with the long-term public and social needs that we have as a country. In particular, I think the budget failed the accountability test that the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu set a number of years ago, where he said a nation's success can be measured by how well it looks after its most vulnerable. And really, almost no one is more vulnerable in this country than children who are living in poverty. And it's particularly disappointing that the budget has so little ambition on this subject, because that is actually an area where, although it may not always feel like it, we have made some progress as a country in the last 15 years. If you go back to the global financial crisis around 2009, and if you imagined a notional classroom, a typical classroom with 30 children in it, at that time 6 of them would have been living in poverty. Up to about 2022, so a couple of years ago, and across a couple of different administrations, we got that down to 3 children in this notional classroom of 30 living in poverty. That was the rate overall in 2022. So a really significant reduction. Because Labour then slightly took their eye off the ball and failed to protect the poorest families against the cost of living spike, that number last year had risen to about 4 children in this notional classroom of 30. And as other speakers have alluded to, that's just the overall number for children in poverty. That's significantly higher, unacceptably higher for Māori children, for Pacifica children, for children with disabilities. The government's lack of ambition on the subject is all the more troubling, because in addition to that overall progress that was seen since 2009, the last government under Jacinda Ardern set some very ambitious targets for reducing child poverty still further. The official ambition for 2028, which this government has notionally signed up to, is to reduce child poverty down to the point in 2028 where in this notional classroom of 30 children, only 1 of them, or perhaps 2 of them, is living in poverty. Now that is something that should motivate us. It would put us amongst the best performers in the developed world. It's something we should find inspiring as a target, because I think we are an ambitious country. We are a practical, problem-solving country. We have achieved great things as a country in the past. We should be aiming to meet that target and meet it emphatically, but we are nowhere near on track. In the budget documents yesterday, there were projections published for the 3 main measures of child poverty out to 2028. On the first one, which I think Craig referenced, the number of families who say they're going out without the basics, like being able to heat their homes or afford decent clothing for their children. It's not possible to forecast that, so that's a question mark. On the second measure, which is looking at whether poor families have been getting richer since 2018 after their housing costs are included, the forecast is that that measure will remain absolutely flat. And on the third measure, which is looking at whether the incomes of the poorest families are keeping pace with the incomes of middle families, the projections that will increase. So on the 3 key measures of child poverty, forecasts are don't know, staying the same, and getting worse. So for me, that represents absolute failure as a budget. You can talk about operating allowances, spending allowances, debts, deficits, new initiatives, none of it means anything if the extra growth, the extra prosperity we're seeing as a country is not helping the children in greatest need. And why is that the case? Why are we not on track to meet those targets? Why has the government shown so little ambition? It is because, and again other speakers have alluded to this, because of this obsession with keeping spending down. The government has put us, I think, not on a huge slash and burn austerity track, but, as Shamubeel was saying, on a track towards reducing the size of government down towards government spending about 30% of GDP, which has been a loose sort of consensus about how big government spending should be in New Zealand in the last half century or so, but one that is entirely a political choice. There's no reason government spending has to stay at 30% of GDP. If we taxed at the rate of many typical European countries, we would have another $20 to $30 billion a year to spend on public services and to tackle child poverty, amongst other things. But we don't have that. Instead, what we have is a budget which is very much a sinking lid, just squeezing, squeezing, squeezing. We've heard about the health spending, for instance, and that sounds impressive on the face of it, another $17 billion for health over the next 4 to 6 years. The problem is that, and again this was alluded to, the official estimate is that over that period, 13 billion of that will be needed just to maintain existing services, just to deal with inflation, wage increases, providing the same level of services to an ageing population. So there's very little there for genuinely new initiatives. Same story in education, same story across the board. Next year, the government has set aside $2.4 billion in new spending. The Treasury's estimate is that just to maintain existing services, it will take $2.5 billion. So as Shamubeel said, the forecast is for cuts upon cuts upon cuts, an ever-sinking lid for no actual reason. So there's this enormous determination to drive down spending, which is matched by an equally ironclad desire not to raise the revenue that we might need to tackle the social problems that we face. And so we urgently need to restart or continue the discussion about new forms of taxation, about introducing capital gains taxes or wealth taxes or inheritance taxes, something along those lines. If we had that extra revenue that we need as a country, we'd be able to genuinely deal with the things that are the drivers of child poverty. And I sort of think of those as the five key drivers, 5 great evils, if you like. One of the big problems of those 5 are inadequate income for people who are on benefits. And in this budget, no intention of addressing that at all. In fact, beneficiaries are explicitly excluded from all the cost of living measures aimed at the quote-unquote squeezed middle. In fact, National will increase benefits significantly slower than Labour was going to, pushing more children into child poverty. Secondly, inadequate incomes from work, no intention to address that, and as Craig has pointed out, the minimum wage increase in April of 2%, significantly lower than inflation, currently running at 4%. So actually the poorest working people are going backwards. And someone on the minimum wage from the budget, tax cuts announced last night, will get $12 a week. Third big issue, third great evil, the lack of adequate housing. We need probably something like 40,000, that's right, 40,000 state houses overnight to get back to the 1991 level of provision, which was not particularly generous. Instead, all we have is a pledge to maybe fund the running costs of 500 social houses a year. And as Alan has pointed out, even that pledge strains credulity. Fourth great evil, debt, particularly the amount of debt that the poorest families owe both to the state and to private operators. No intention in the budget of dealing with that. And fifthly, a kind of overarching problem that I see is the lack of autonomy and the lack of self-determination for the poorest New Zealand communities. Because my vision for a better world, my vision for a country in which we fundamentally and finally eliminate the abomination that is child poverty, isn't one in which those solutions are handed down, isn't one in which those decisions are taken from on high by people from my demographic. It's one in which those communities are actually put in a position where they can determine their own futures, where with assistance from the state, they can find a way of lifting themselves up. But there was nothing in the budget that I could see that would enhance tēnā rangatiratanga. Indeed, Te Pāti Māori would argue very strongly the opposite. There was nothing that I could see that would restore power and autonomy and dignity to those communities that are struggling the most. The budget absolutely did not deliver that, and so I think all that remains to be said is that we will have to create that change ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I just want to say thank you for being here, but also given that we have a mendacious, mean-spirited, miserly government and they're likely to serve only one term, what should the next centre-left government do? Should they hit the ground running, taxing capital, or is it a matter of wiping the Rogernomics slate clean and getting rid of things like the Reserve Bank Act or the Employment Contracts Act? I just want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for the easy, the softball question. Look, two things maybe. One of which is less encouraging, but the other one hopefully more encouraging. I wouldn't bank on this being a one-term government, to be honest. Things are very tough right now. They're not popular, but all the forecasts are for, by the time the next election runs around, for the economy to be growing at a reasonable clip, for unemployment to be falling again, for inflation to be relatively low. They may actually have the conditions to run, at least a credible campaign in 2026. And I think, and they will be aided by the fact that certainly the mood music, to some extent, the genuine analysis of the last government has been pretty negative. I don't think the last government was well prepared to be in government. Didn't hit the ground running. I don't think it necessarily always knew what it wanted the state to do or how to make the state do what it wanted to do. So I think the next government will have to be better intellectually prepared. We'll also hope to face much less challenging conditions, of course, than the last government did, with COVID and possibly even worse than that, having to work with Winston Peters. Although, who knows what the future will bring. I won't give you a sort of shopping list of policies because I think we'd be here all night. I do think tax reform is essential, and there's a very live debate about, is that a wealth tax? Do you just tax wealth outright, which is potentially more powerful but more controversial, or do you go for a capital gains tax, which is sort of less confrontational perhaps to the interests of capital and the wealthy, but it's very orthodox and for which the arguments are probably easier to win. The only thing I'll say finally at a general level is that we do need a different vision of the economy, and I know the people from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance here, and just at a very high level, I do think we need to anchor the idea that the economy is here fundamentally to serve the interests of the planet, to protect, and indeed to regenerate, to regenerate the environment, which we have damaged so much, particularly in the post-war period. But beyond that, it is to serve people's well-being, to ensure that everyone lives well and that it delivers resources in an equitable, inclusive way to ensure that everyone has the foundation, the economic foundation of a good life.
So I guess, having Listen to all our esteemed speakers this morning. I, for one, am much more upskilled in terms of what went on yesterday while I was not available. So it's given me the impetus to be able to go and further delve into things that probably I should know but don't really know. So I'd just like to make a few acknowledgements before I invite the Reverend Stephen King to close us. So Dave, thank you so much for working through and giving us a sound and giving us voice today. To our lovely people who organised the breakfast so early, thank you for being here, and of the welcoming committee, for Gail and her team for organising this. Very much appreciated. To all our speakers, to Collin Tukuitonga, Saunoamaali'i, Karanina, Sumeo, Alan Johnson, Renney, Shamubeel Eaqub, Max Rashbrooke, very much appreciated your learned experiences that you've shared with us today in the spirit of sharing and learning. And of course, Reverend Stephen King for this magnificent place that we are here today. And of course to all of you out there, if you weren't here, we wouldn't be here. So as we close, and as Stephen closes, wishing you well, safe travels into your Friday, and of course into the long weekend. Enjoy the King's birthday Monday off. Kia ora.
Just to sneak in, so I'd like to give a gift to each of our speakers.
Thank you, everybody. Well done for coming out. It's only 9 o'clock on Friday morning, just so you know. And I know it's not the weekend, but I reckon you can get away and stay here just a little bit longer. It counts as protest. Okay? There's plenty of coffee. There is still breakfast. There are people in this room that you will not see again for a long time. There are people you need to meet in this room. So please take the time to network. In my job description, there's a thing about faith. I have faith that the things that we are concerned about can be made better. I have faith because you showed up. But unless we continue to gather, unless we continue to ask the hard questions, the why questions, like we always talk about the top of the cliff and the bottom of the cliff. Why does no one question the reality of there being a cliff? We've had some of our speakers talk about same. We pull this lever, we tweak this thing, and the children are still in poverty. And our most marginalised communities are still our most marginalised communities. So there is a systemic underlying problem that we, the people, need to begin to push those in power to address. And how do we do that? We do that by gathering, and we do that by sharing our resources and our understanding. I'm just going to, before I pray, one little push for another place that we can continue to gather, where we can continue to ask the hard why questions, where we can continue to reject answers that treat us like we're idiots, or that we are naive, or that use the word because as their primary platform. There's some brochures like this up the back as you head out after you've had more coffee and food. They talk about a CTU program called Reimagining Aotearoa Together. The CTU is trying to pull together a national conversation about this. You belong to groups, you belong to organisations that should be part of this. Please take a brochure, please engage. Let us pray. Creator God, thank you for all who have gathered this morning. Thank you for the care, compassion, and concern that is reflected in our gathering. Lord, bless us as we go out into our week, as we go out into this country. Bless us with persistence. Bless us with wisdom. Bless us with the courage to stand and ask the questions why. And Lord, bless us with not being complacent and not accepting a status quo that leaves us feeling so profoundly sad. Lord, thank you for all who gathered today. Lord, bless them all. Bless our speakers. Amen.